She bought a broken fort for $12, and it saved her when everything else failed. The winter of 1883 didn't arrive like a season. It arrived like a decision. One morning, the wind changed direction, and by afternoon, the land no longer belonged to the people who lived on it. Snow didn't fall in layers. It erased distance. The horizon disappeared. Paths stopped existing, and everything that once felt separate became one continuous exposure. In Crow's Ridge, they thought they understood winter. They had seen it before, prepared for it before. Wood stacked, doors reinforced, fires ready. Because most winters followed rules. This one didn't. But on the first day, no one knew that yet. At the edge of town, where the last cabins gave way to open land, a 17-year-old girl stood outside the trading post, with everything she owned in a wooden crate. 2 dresses, a patched wool coat, a bent cooking pan, a Bible that wasn't hers originally, and $12. 3 days earlier, she had been told to leave. No room, no food, no reason to keep her through winter. She didn't argue, because arguments don't create resources. They only delay reality. So she packed, collected what was owed, and walked. By the time she reached the trading post, the sky had already begun to close. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and certainty. Men stood near the stove, speaking quietly about cattle, about supplies, about how early the cold had come. Eliza didn't join them. She stood near the wall, warming her hands, listening. Because listening tells you more than asking. That was when she saw it. A paper pinned unevenly behind the counter, not placed carefully, not meant to be taken seriously. She stepped closer, read it once, then again. Old fort structure for sale. $12. The shopkeeper noticed, let out a short breath. That one's not for you. Eliza looked at him. Why not? He leaned forward slightly. Because it's nothing. Stone, wind, broken walls. He gestured toward the ridge outside. Been empty longer than anyone remembers. Another voice from the stove. Cold sits in those stones. Leave. A few quiet laughs followed. Not loud, just certain, because to them, the outcome was obvious. Eliza didn't respond immediately. She wasn't deciding if the fort was good. She was deciding if anything else was better. There were no rooms left. No families taking in strangers. No work that came with shelter. Winter had already removed those options. The fort was the only thing left that existed. And in winter, something is always more than nothing. She reached into her coat, placed the money on the counter, I'll take it. The room shifted. Not louder. Focused. You understand what you're buying? The shopkeeper asked. Eliza nodded once. It has walls. That was all she said, because that was all she needed. She picked up the paper, folded it, placed it inside her coat, then lifted the crate and walked back into the cold. No one followed. No one tried to stop her, because from where they stood, nothing needed to be done. The result had already been decided. The ridge rose slowly beyond the settlement, then steeper, then silent. The fort appeared halfway up, larger than expected, not intact, not gone. Stone walls still standing, dark against the snow, unmoved by the wind that moved everything else. She climbed, each step heavier than the last, the crate pulling against her arms, the wind pressing into her coat, finding every opening. But she didn't stop, because turning back was a different kind of risk, and she had already chosen. When she reached the gate, she paused. It leaned outward, rust frozen into its hinges. She set the crate down, pushed. Metal resisted, then gave. Inside, the fort was worse than it looked. Snow filled the courtyard. Beams collapsed inward. Walls cracked open, letting the wind pass through without resistance. It wasn't shelter. Not yet. But it wasn't useless either. She walked the perimeter slowly, touching the stone. Cold, but solid. It didn't bend, didn't shift. Shift didn't fail the way wood failed. It held. That mattered. In one corner, where two walls met, she found it. A space that blocked the wind from two directions. Not complete, but different. And inside that space, half buried beneath debris, an iron stove. Old, rust-covered, but intact. She cleared it with her hands, opened the door, waited. The hinge moved. That was enough. She didn't rest, not yet. Light was already fading, and winter doesn't wait for readiness. She moved quickly, dragging broken beams, stacking what could burn, filling gaps with stone, packing snow into smaller cracks. Not because snow was strong, because it slowed movement, and slowing the wind changed everything. By night, her hands were numb, her breath uneven, but the fire held. Small, then steady. The stove warmed slowly, then began to radiate outward, not intense, consistent. She sat close, not too close. The wind still moved through the fort, but differently, weaker in that corner. She leaned back against the stone wall, felt it. Cold at first, then something else, not warm, but no longer taking from her the same way. She noticed that, held on to it, because survival doesn't begin with strength. It begins with understanding. And that night, in a place everyone else had already dismissed, Eliza Morin didn't think about whether the fort would save her. She thought about something else. What the stone was doing, how it held heat, how it slowed loss, how the wind changed when it met it. Because the question wasn't, is this enough? The question was, how do I make it work? And once that question is asked, everything changes. They said the stone held cold, that it trapped it, that it never let it go. They weren't wrong. They were just measuring the wrong thing. Because the problem wasn't what the stone held. It was how fast everything else lost. Wood walls lost heat quickly. Air inside changed constantly. Every gap, every seam, an opening for the cold to move through. That was the difference. The fort didn't stop the cold. It slowed the change. And slowing change is what creates stability. She noticed it the second night. The fire had dropped lower than before. The wood nearly gone. And still, the space around her didn't collapse the way it should have. Not warm, but not empty either. She placed her hand against the stone again, waited. This time, it felt different. The cold wasn't pulling from her the same way. It was holding something. Not much, but enough to notice. That was when she understood. The fire didn't just heat the air. It changed the stone. Slowly, layer by layer, it stored what the air couldn't keep. And when the fire dropped, the stone gave it back. Not quickly, not intensely, but steadily. That was the system. Not heat. Retention. She stood up, walked the broken perimeter again. The gaps in the wall weren't just letting wind in. They were accelerating loss. Air moving through, carrying heat with it. The faster it moved, the more it took. So she changed that. Not by sealing everything. That would trap moisture, create pressure, cause failure somewhere else. Instead, she slowed it. Packed snow into the larger openings, not tightly, layered. Because snow doesn't block air. It breaks it. Each layer forcing movement to change direction, reducing speed, reducing loss. She left small gaps where the smoke needed to move, where pressure needed release. Because a system that can't breathe fails from inside. By morning, the wind still entered the fort, but not the same way. It didn't rush through. didn't carry heat out in a single motion. It moved slower, weaker, less capable of taking. That was enough. She stepped outside briefly, only a few seconds, and felt the difference immediately. The open air pulled at her, stripped warmth without resistance, took from her faster than she could replace it. She stepped back inside, and the loss stopped accelerating. That was when the second realization came. The fort wasn't cold. It was stable. And stability is more valuable than warmth. Because warmth can be created, but if it cannot be held, it doesn't matter. She looked around the broken structure again, at the collapsed beams, the open sections, the parts everyone else had dismissed. They saw damage. She saw something else. A system already started. Stone to hold. Snow to regulate. Air that could be controlled instead of stopped. It didn't need to be rebuilt. It needed to be understood. And once understood, it could be used. That was the shift, not from weak to strong, but from random to controlled. And control is what winter cannot take easily. Once she understood the stone, she stopped trying to fix the fort and started building around what already worked. The others would have rebuilt the walls, raised timber, sealed everything tight, tried to make it a house. She didn't, because houses lose heat. Systems hold it. The first thing she changed was how the fire was used. Not bigger, not constant. Controlled. She fed it in cycles, small burns, letting the stone absorb everything. Then she let it fall. Not to zero, just enough. Because if the fire never drops, the system never stores. It just replaces. And replacement is always more expensive than retention. The second change was the ground. At first, she thought the cold came from the air. Then she felt it through the floor. A slow, constant pull, taking heat downward. The earth beneath her was colder than the air above, and it didn't stop taking. So she broke the contact. Not completely, just enough. She laid broken boards across the stone, raised her space slightly, created a thin layer of air between her and the ground. That layer changed everything. Because direct contact transfers fast, separation slows it. Now, the heat didn't disappear as quickly. It stayed long enough to matter. The third change was the walls. Not rebuilding, repositioning. She didn't close every gap. She chose which ones mattered. The north-facing breaks, those took the full force of the wind. She packed them thicker, layer by layer. Snow, dirt, debris, until the air slowed before it reached her. The southern side she left lighter, because not all air is the same. Some removes heat, some replaces it. Control isn't about stopping everything. It's about choosing what passes through. Inside, the space became smaller, not because she wanted less room, because volume is loss. More space means more air. More air means more to heat, more to lose. So she reduced it, pulled her sleeping space closer to the stone, closer to where heat stayed longest, moved supplies inward, condensed everything into one controlled area. But efficient. That was enough. By the end of the first week, the fort wasn't warmer, but it changed slower. The fire lasted longer. The cold took more time to return. The space held its condition. That was the goal. Not to fight winter, but to stop reacting to it. Because reaction is constant effort. Control reduces it. Outside, the valley continued the same way. Fires burning high, wood disappearing quickly, people feeding the heat constantly, trying to keep up with the loss. Inside the fort, she stopped trying to keep up and started letting the system work. Small fire, stored heat, reduced loss. That was all it needed. And by the time the cold deepened, she wasn't surviving the same way they were, because she wasn't replacing what winter took. She was making sure it took less. The cold didn't peak all at once. It narrowed. Day by day, it took something smaller each time until nothing small was left. By mid-January, the valley had changed. Not in structure, in behavior. Fires burned earlier, longer, hotter. Wood piles dropped faster than expected. Trips outside became shorter, less frequent, because every movement cost more than it used to. That was the first sign. Not failure. Increase. Increase in effort. Increase in what was required just to remain the same. Then came the second. Breakdown. Not sudden, not dramatic. Gradual. One chimney stopped drawing properly, smoke filling the room instead of leaving it. Another fire burned through its supply too fast, leaving nothing for the night. A door froze shut on one house, then wouldn't seal again once opened. Small failures that compounded, because once a system loses control, everything accelerates. The fort didn't follow that pattern. The fire still burned, then dropped, then returned. The temperature inside shifted, but slowly. The cold entered, but not directly. Nothing changed fast enough to break it. That was the difference. She didn't need to add more. She just didn't lose as much. On the 9th day of deep cold, the first person came. Not announced, not expected. A figure moving across the ridge, slow, uneven, not heading toward anything, just trying to continue. He reached the outer wall, didn't knock, just leaned against the stone, because at that point, formality disappears. She opened the door. The change was immediate. Not warmth, reduction. The wind stopped stripping from him. The air stopped moving through him. The loss slowed. He stood there, breathing unevenly, not speaking, because what he felt didn't match what he expected. "Stay," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. By the next day, another came. Then 2 more. Not many. Word had moved. Not through explanation, through observation. Smoke still rising. Not heavy, not constant. Steady. That was enough. Because in that kind of cold, consistency becomes signal. Inside the fort, the system adjusted. More bodies, more heat, more retention. The stone absorbed it, held it, returned it slowly. The space didn't collapse under the change. It stabilized, because it had been built for that. Outside, the valley continued to fail. Not all at once, one structure at a time. Wood ran out. Fire dropped too low. Recovery became impossible. Because once loss exceeds input, there is no return. One house emptied, then another. Movement stopped completely. Not by choice, by limit. Inside the fort, movement still existed. Small adjustments, small changes. Enough to maintain control. That was all it needed. Because the system didn't require intensity. It required consistency. On the 12th day, the wind dropped slightly. Not gone, reduced. And for the first time, the valley could be seen again. What remained was not what had been there before, because winter hadn't just tested them. It had removed everything that couldn't hold. And the fort was still there. Not stronger, not larger, just unchanged. Because it had never depended on replacing what was lost, only on reducing how much was taken. When the cold finally loosened, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like something had been proven. Not by words, not by plans, by what remained. The valley didn't come back all at once. The snow stayed. The silence stayed. And the absence stayed longest. Where houses had stood, there were shapes lower than before, broken or empty. Smoke rose from fewer places, not because people left, because systems had failed. They had burned more, worked harder, added everything they could, and still lost. Inside the fort, nothing had been added, nothing excessive, nothing forced, only controlled. That was the difference. Not strength, behavior. When the others came again, they didn't laugh. They didn't question. They observed. One man placed his hand on the stone wall, waited. "It's not warm," he said. She nodded. "It doesn't need to be." Another looked at the fire, small, steady, unchanged. "You're not burning enough," he said. "I'm not losing as much." That was harder to understand, because they had been solving the wrong problem. They tried to create more heat when they should have been keeping it. They tried to fight winter instead of changing how it affected them. Elias Rudin stood near the entrance, looking at the broken valley below, then back at the fort. "You didn't survive because it was strong," he said. She shook her head. "It survived because it didn't change." He stood there a moment longer, then nodded. Not agreement, recognition. That spring, the rebuilding didn't follow the same pattern. Not everyone changed, but enough did. Some moved closer to stone. Some reduced open space. Some stopped sealing everything tight and started controlling how air moved instead. Not because they were told to, because they had seen the result. And once something works under pressure, it becomes impossible to ignore. Years later, when people spoke about that winter, they didn't talk about how cold it was. They talked about what failed and what didn't. And one thing remained clear. She didn't build a better shelter. She used what was already there in a way no one else had. Because survival isn't about adding more. It's about losing less. And once you understand that, everything changes. Even winter.